Keynote speaker, someone who knows firsthand about the importance of the Endangered Species Act and the challenges it is facing right now. As director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Martha Williams oversees the entire National Wildlife Refuge System, manages migratory bird populations, protects endangered and threatened species, restores native fish species and aquatic habitats, and enforces wildlife conservation laws, including the ESA. Most recently, she testified in support of the ESA at a hearing of the House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries, a hearing where anti-wildlife politicians attacked the law, spread misinformation, and laid the groundwork for legislative activity to dismantle the ESA. We appreciate her leadership at the service, stewarding the protection and recovery of more than 1,600 listed species. We are grateful for her participation at this symposium and for the opportunity to hear her perspectives on this important law. Thanks so much, Martha, for being here today with us. Please join me in welcoming the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Martha Williams.
Thank you, Jamie. I think it takes one to know one, right? So she understands from having been the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service before being this incredibly important role that she's in now. Just what it takes to try to really honor the responsibility of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service along with our sister agency. I'm so glad to see that Janet Coit is here today. NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, in implementing the Endangered Species Act. So I want to start with letting you all know just how solemnly I personally take that role. It's an honor, it's a privilege, and I also know that all of the employees of the Fish and Wildlife Service live and breathe this work. I was recently, just last week, meeting with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and I want to talk about that more, the incredibly important role of indigenous knowledge in our work with tribes. But in meeting with the Mashpee last week, one tribal member got up and very eloquently spoke and very passionately and said, you know, to us, the Endangered Species Act nature, it's not just a job. And aren't you lucky at the Fish and Wildlife Service in some respects that it's just a job for you? And I thankfully took a deep breath and thought about it and thought about what he was trying to say to me and to listen to it. And I wanted to respond and I didn't. That so many of us, all of you in this room, I think it's something we share. The Fish and Wildlife Service, it's not just a job for us. And that comes with pros and cons. It's a double-edged sword. But the employees I meet as I travel around the country and the world, they take their responsibility very seriously too. We may not always agree on how best to implement the Endangered Species Act, but I want you to know that we take our roles to heart. And why? Why do we? And I think that's the value of a summit like this. I want to thank you, Jamie. I want to thank everyone in the room for gathering to talk about the Endangered Species Act because it's so incredibly important to who we are as Americans. It's so important to our world. It's important to our survival as a species ourselves. And so thank you for gathering and being so engaged in these discussions. I think sometimes the controversy around the Endangered Species Act, even congressional litigation one-on-one, means people care, and it means people are engaged, and how much poorer we would be as a people, as a nation, if people didn't care. And if I can pass on one word of advice, one desire for all of us collectively going forward from today's summit, is to take seriously our charge to talk about the why, to really hit home. Why does the Endangered Species Act matter to Americans? Why does it matter to me? Why does it matter to you? Why does it matter to an Alaska Native community? Why does it matter to industry? And I think it's up to us to constantly be telling the why, to be telling the stories that sometimes I think as bureaucrats, we can shy away from the heart. Like we don't want to be seen as too emotional. Well, you know what? It does cut to the heart. It cuts to our minds and our hearts, and it cuts to the biological integrity of the nature and the world around us and our survival as a species, but we really care. And I think it's good for us to be telling those stories and connecting in a way that is more emotional. So why does the Endangered Species Act matter now more than ever? Why does nature matter? Well, I think the obvious answers, maybe not obvious to everyone, is biodiversity is key to our food security. Without these pollinators that I think struggle, right? They're in some respects, the canary in the coal mines, the canaries in the coal mine, the pollinators that have sometimes slipped between the cracks of regulation until they get to the point where we're worried about them being threatened or endangered. We rely on them for our food security, for our nation's economy. We rely on biodiversity for medicine, for the medicines that we use on an everyday basis, our most common medicines. But we also rely on biodiversity for the hope of the next cure for some disease. How do we know if a species blinks out that species wasn't critical to developing some cure in the future? We know that biodiversity is critical to the ecosystem functions in our world, to our clean water, to resilience in the face of drought, fire, floods, sea level rise, invasive species. We know that biodiversity is so impacted by habitat fragmentation. We know that biodiversity matters for the wonder and awe of nature. Who would we be individually? Or let me ask you, is anyone in this room not been moved at some point by the awe of some species, whether it's seeing a grizzly bear? Yes, I'm wearing my grizzly bear earrings for you all today to carry that inner grizzly bear spirit. Has anyone in this room not been in awe of some plant or species? Right? It's so essential to us to know that our minds can think of the awe. A friend of mine is an author and does research on nature and the mind and how helpful it is to us and our well-being. We know that during the pandemic, how many people sought nature as a place of respite, as a place to heal. We know that biodiversity is critical to our community health. We know that biodiversity is critical to our economy. We know that biodiversity is so critical to so many cultures, to us spiritually, to Native Americans through time immemorial. And that connection, I think sometimes we have lost, and it's time for us to reconnect. So that's my charge, is for all of us to remember the why, to talk about the why, and to keep those efforts at reconnection going. I think of the Endangered Species Act as our most important tool for saving life on Earth. It's critical to our very own existence. And that's partly because the more we learn, the more science shows us that nature is so inextricably connected. It's that web of life. When you pull one thread, you need to be really careful because it has other exponential effects down the line. And so we've got to pay attention to that. We know that the Endangered Species Act is a piece that's so important to Native American cultures, that we have changed our natural world around us, and sometimes in ways where we didn't ask for advice, right? We just charged forward and thought that we were so in charge of nature, and it turns out not so much. And had we just listened to some indigenous knowledge on prescribed fire, where I've gotten to think about the awe, where I've gone and looked at longleaf pine restoration, and plants have come back in that restored ecosystem that haven't been there for 100 years. To just think about the long term, and if we can return to that long view, to the interconnectivity of nature, I think we would all be in a better spot. So I also worry, and I've talked to Jamie about this some, but I don't always talk about it. I think that our nation, the world, is becoming more and more aware of the impacts of climate. Certainly this summer has, showed us with drought, with fire, with unprecedented heat waves, with the ocean off of Florida being so hot. All of these impacts that we maybe haven't seen before. We forget, though, I think sometimes to translate that to, if that's so hard on us, what does it do to this intricate web of nature? How do we make sure when we talk about climate, we are also including biodiversity? That you can't talk about one without the other, that it's up to us in this room because we get it to make that connection. So in some respects, we face these existential threats for biodiversity and extinction crisis. We face these existential threats with climate. But on the flip side, I have extraordinary hope. And I have hope for these reasons, because when you give nature a chance, when you invest in it, it has an extraordinary ability to heal, but you have to give it a chance. So I think of those examples where if we repair where fish have had a barrier for 100 years and you remove it. I just was in Providence, Rhode Island, which Janet knows well, and literally minutes after a barrier was removed, alewife returned. That we can remove a barrier for salmon in Alaska, and they're there within months after 100 years of not being there. I think of that work that we can do that really makes an impact, but you have to give nature a chance. So thinking forward of the Endangered Species Act, I will echo, I think, a number of other thoughts that will come out in the summit today. And that is, one, to remember the why, that we talk about and recognize the interconnected nature, our web of nature, that we reinvigorate and listen to indigenous knowledge, that we learn from so many tribes that their lives are so connected to nature, and that we reconnect in the way that we can learn from so many of our elders. That we think about at the Fish and Wildlife Service with NOAA, that we think about within the US government and the way we implement the Endangered Species Act, we do it in an all-of-government approach, that we know we have permitting challenges ahead of us, but if each federal agency that already has a charge to make sure their actions do not jeopardize a species, that we do this work together, that it doesn't just fall on the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, but that we undertake this work together. It will make our projects better and stronger for everyone. That we also realize that when we invest in the Endangered Species Act working, when we show why we should believe in it, we can get our work done and we can be more proactive. I also want to add that this collective effort working with our partners gets us so far. At the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've been talking about the standards of excellence, an approach to the work we do across the board, ESA implementation or otherwise, that we know and relate to a community, that we add value to a community, that we really work with others and build partnerships in a more fulsome way than maybe we did before. That does not mean we don't use the backstop of the Endangered Species Act. So much of our work is non-regulatory, At the same time, I do not ever want to give up that regulatory component, that really the buck stops with us, and that we are serious in this nation and what the Endangered Species Act was meant to be to begin with. I can't believe I came today without my copy. I have to say I go everywhere with my copy of the Endangered Species Act, and we'll hand it up. So next time I'll make sure I bring it with me. So I will end saying, go forth. We want to work with you. The Endangered Species Act matters. It matters to the American public. It captures so much of who we are. So let's keep it going. Let's make sure it sticks around and that we apply it fulsomely, but in a more across the board, that we spread out and share how we apply it. And I would end that honey sometimes can get you, can attract more bees. We can get more done, but don't forget we should still always have the backstop of the Endangered Species Act, for which I am incredibly grateful. In one last sentence, this has become my life's work. And I realized the other day, perhaps this is not a coincidence, and that the last passenger pigeon happened to be Martha. So I take my name seriously, and I want you to know, I just want you to know that. And I go talk to Martha from time to time at the Smithsonian. So just thank you all for your engagement and commitment.